Okay, a few more examples of British literature here, both in century past and in quite recent times. So here, in the heart of the Victorian era, we have Charles Dickens. Now, Charles Dickens was both a writer and also a social critic. So as we've mentioned previously, when we were talking about the Victorian era and the Christmas traditions, which is a cultural export in itself, which we won't duplicate here, but talked about Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, which captures the strata of society there, and the sort of Christmas ideals that are formulating in the Victorian era. But all of his other works really do hit a lot harder at social issues that were concerns of the Victorian era. Dickens left school to work in a factory and gained a lot of life experience that way, and he's probably the most famous novelist that has been produced in British history. Maybe at least of novels that have sort of a social critique to them. An example here is Oliver Twist. Now, some of these are probably a bit more famous in decades past. The sense I get, I don't have any data to back this up, but the sense I get is that some of these have fallen out of favor as far as people's awareness of them. Maybe it's just the world has become a bit more globalized, so some of these have gotten elbowed out of the way in favor of other stories. But the significance here is in the sort of human element. So Oliver Twist focused on the workhouse. So in 1834, there was a poor law passed in the UK that said that the poor didn't get government aid unless they worked in workhouses. And so these were places that you must work to eat kind of facility. And so Dickens is using a poor foundling, a parentless child, as an example of a way to criticize that system as sort of inhumane and just immoral in a lot of ways. So it's Victorian in that it had a reform mindset, but it still speaks to us today in looking at systems that hurt more than they help. Another example here is Great Expectations. This one is about an orphan growing up. It's done in the first person, which is interesting and different way to do things at the time. And he was actually famous in his own lifetime, which some authors and artists can't really claim, but he did well for himself and became sort of a conscience of the era, and he's still quite famous today. Very complex person, some definite negative personality or personal qualities, but he's still ranked as one of the greats of literature, and we still look to his works even today. Another one that you may be a bit more familiar with is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of Sherlock Holmes. At least you're familiar with Sherlock Holmes. You may not be familiar with Arthur Conan Doyle, but he is writing right at the very end of the Victorian era and right into the beginning of the 20th century. And by that point, applied science had become the thing. We had the experimental university level type science going on, experiments in electromagnetism and all that throughout the 1800s. But by the end of the century, people are very aware of the benefits of the scientific discoveries that are happening and how they can be applied in everyday life. And this is revealing that in Sherlock Holmes, who is just a person of science and focuses solely on that as the power of deduction and understanding how the world works, and scientifically helps a lot. And in it you see a lot of sort of a distillation of a lot of the developments in the Victorian era. So you see gritty industrial cities that become sort of the background to these battle of wits that and investigations. And then you also see travel by train as a very common way that the characters get around, new forms of communication, and just reliance on science and strength of mind. Another area that's worth pointing you towards is children's literature. Maybe more than any other, this is where we still see the effects of British literature through the years in our own culture. We still see versions of Alice in Wonderland getting made, and this was made by Lewis Carroll. It was a series from the 1850s, so again, they're in the heart of the Victorian era. But children's literature is a bit dark as far as children's literature goes, but as it was in a past century. Another is Beatrix Potter, which is a great name for an author. The Tale of Peter Rabbit. This one, you don't see this one as much as you did maybe 1, 2, 3 decades ago, but it is still a significant, and you'll see it pop up, get retold, that kind of thing. So she and her brother in the 1890s were designing Christmas cards, as Victorians appreciated those, and their subject matter had mice and rabbits as the characters on the cards, and they were very popular. They gained some notoriety, and some magazines began to purchase some of their drawings to go be published in the magazines. And as they gain popularity, Beatrix Potter wants to turn those drawings. She has some ideas for stories to go along with them, so she wanted to turn those into sort of illustrated stories. At the same time, she had a friend who had an ill child and had been writing letters to the child, sort of telling a story about some characters named Flopsy and Mopsy and Cottontail and Peter. And she eventually would take those and mold them with her illustration abilities, and puts together the first book for the Tales of Peter Rabbit by 1900 and gets published in 1902 and becomes a sort of a British staple, is the Beatrix Potter collection. And then A.A. Milne, Milne, Winnie the Pooh, and the 100 Acre Wood, and all of their friends in the Tigger and Pooh and Kanga and Owl and Rabbit, all that group, and the boy character in there, Christopher Robin. So this was a character that was developed in 1924 and then kind of gets published in a variety of ways thereafter. And they there's a lot of continuing popularity there, and more versions of it that get produced over time especially through Disney. The most recent incarnation, I believe, is the Christopher Robin movie that was done in 2018. That was with Ewan McGregor, and it's actually quite good. I got to catch it quite recently, and it's a different take on it, where Christopher Robin has grown up and then has to kind of come back and rediscover his childhood self, and it's a solid enjoyable movie there. And then a big one that has taken the world by storm in fairly recent years here is J.R.R. Tolkien and his works, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And so if you haven't had a chance to read the books, I would understand The Hobbit is actually, you can get through that fairly quickly. Lord of the Rings, the 3 books together, even if you have a small printing of it, it's a good chunk of text, and I would understand that being a bit of a daunting task. But the movies are great, and so especially the Lord of the Rings trilogy. If you haven't had the chance to see those, if you're have some extra time, want to binge a Oscar-winning series, they're really excellent, and so I do recommend all that. But Tolkien himself, many people would assume that It's actually a New Zealand tale these days, if they haven't looked into it at all, because it was filmed in New Zealand, and the films themselves took on a little bit of New Zealand quality simply because of the landscape and everything that goes into their production was, just amazing. And so that's, it has that sort of infused into it now, but it is very much British in its themes. So J.R.R. Tolkien here was a British scholar of the English language, and his goal in all of this was to create a mythology. He was saddened by the fact that English folk didn't really have a mythology in the same way that the Mediterranean had a mythological origins in the Greek and Roman gods and goddesses and that kind of thing. And so that was something that he wanted to set out to create. So he grew up in the Midlands, there, in the Birmingham region, understood both the rural world and the grimy industrial world of the early 20th century, and saw how the industrial world kind of corrupted and just ate up the rural and took away that pastoral beauty. And so that was something that he was personally offended by to a certain extent. He was a product of World War I, and was spent 4 months on the Western Front, in and out of trenches, and ended up getting sick, and then spent the rest of the war at home, where he continued home service until the end of the war. After that, he entered academia, became an Oxford professor, and would go on to study the English language specifically, but also dabble in writing for this creation of this mythology. And so he would go on to produce The Hobbit in 1937. And the story goes that as a professor, he was at the end of the semester grading papers, and a student had left a page blank. Some schools use answer booklets, like the specific booklets that you write answers to test questions in. And so they left a blank page, and he just had an inspiration, didn't really have any connection to it, but he wrote, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit." And that was it. And I don't think he really had an idea what a hobbit was at the time, but for some reason that phrase came to him, and he sort of ran with it over the coming decades. And so he developed a backstory, and started out with The Hobbit, with the tale of Bilbo Baggins and his journeys with the dwarves there, which became very, very famous. And from there, he wanted to explore that world further and develop more and more of a backstory for it. And so by 1954-55, he releases the Lord of the Rings series, and it's just this enormously massive tome of 3 books. And in addition to that, there's just tons and tons of more mythological backstory that goes back to sort of the creation of the earth and all that sort of thing in his extended writings, which are also collected. If you really want to get nerdy with it and explore those, there's a ton there as well. But in it, you see the themes of concern over war and the destruction it wrought upon the earth, concern for the environment, and how sort of this industrial lack of concern for the world is sort of a cancerous element, industrialism, and the good things that come with a simple life, that sort of pastoral world that the hobbits inhabit in Hobbiton is magical to him. And if you ever get a chance to watch the Lord of the Rings series, the beginning of that very first movie where you see Hobbiton and just its beauty really does kind of capture that essence. So I'm sorry, I jumped forward backwards, but there'll be a video here below where you can check out. It was from the Lord of the Rings DVDs, and it is one of the extras. And that DVD set, or the Blu-ray set, if you ever get a chance to check out the extras, they are really, really quite good. So we'll be right back to discuss a little bit more here on literature.